Hey everyone, Casella here. Thanks for tuning in. Some exciting news. A Meal of Thorns is a finalist for this year's Hugo Awards, as is the Ancillary Review of Books. Big thanks to everyone who nominated us. Big congrats to all the finalists, and you might spot some of our guests and contributors on the ballot as well. I am fairly delighted with this news. Before we get going, in case you don't make it to the end, this podcast and the ARB are free and ad-free. We plan to keep them that way, but your support in donations, in likes or shares or reviews would be very appreciated. Please consider joining our Patreon if you're not already. Okay, on to the show. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Casella Brookins. Each episode, we ask writers, scholars, critics, and other opinion and knowledge havers to talk us through a work of speculative fiction. What makes it interesting or influential, ephemeral or enduring, really good and or really troubling. Today, we are talking about Hope Mirrlee's LUD-IN-THE-MIST, a difficult-to-categorize fantasy novel from 1926. Joining me today is Marita Arvaniti. Marita is a scholar of fantasy and horror and of theater. She's currently finishing up a PhD at the University of Glasgow, hello, University of Glasgow, focusing on authors including Dianna Wynne Jones, Greer Gilman, and Elizabeth Bear, and looking at how conceptions of fairy are shaped by conceptions of theater. Marita, thanks so much for suggesting this book and for joining us today. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. I am very well, slightly nervous to be hearing myself, but other than that, great.
As I said before we were talking, I was so glad that you reached out and suggested this because this has popped up in a few of our discussions already. So it was nice to have an excuse to really dig into it at length. Before we get into Mirrlee's, I was wondering if there's anything else interesting you have been reading or working on that you wanted to talk about.
As for what I'm working on at this point, it's the PhD, and it will continue to be the PhD until I'm free of it. But in the sort of because of that, I have been rereading a lot of books like Fire and Hemlock by Dianna Wynne Jones, Mortal Love by Elizabeth Hand, and Pamela Dean's Tamlin.
Oh, cool.
And I've also been reading a lot of the Terri Windling and Ellen Datlow edited fairytale collections. And I read Madship by Robin Hobb for the first time, which was excellent. That's not for the PhD, that one's just for fun. I've been reading a lot about pirates and generally naval stuff for some reason. I'm also reading the Patrick O'Brian books.
Oh, okay.
So it's all the high seas all the time. I might be missing Greece, I don't know.
Nice. Oh, that's cool. It's interesting to hear Tamlin pop up just because I was just reading again to review Amalo Motar's The River Has Roots, which is coming out here. It should be out by the time this podcast is out, which is drawing on Tamlin and also drawing on LUD-IN-THE-MIST a little bit. So that's a nice rhyme. I also just finished reading Robert Jackson Bennett's new book coming out here, A Drop of Corruption, which is a sequel to The Tainted Cup, which is very fun. It's kind of like this. It's a fantasy world, but it almost runs more like a science fiction. It has this sort of big fantastical kind of alchemical genetical engineering thing they do, but it's basically a murder mystery, pretty strongly in a kind of Sherlock mold, and it's fantastic. It's really, really good. It has, I don't know, I need to think about it more, but it has some interesting things with trying to poke at how detective stories might be anti-imperialist or anti-authoritarian, and I feel like it's kind of getting caught in that contradiction a little bit, but that, I don't know, it's interesting.
It's really interesting how we're drawn to those difficult to categorize books. You know, that's how you introduced LUD-IN-THE-MIST, and that's coming through now in the things that we're reading, I think. So that's really cool, the sort of the slipstream of genre.
Totally, yeah. Oh, I was thinking a lot while reading this, and also while reading a couple other things we've talked about here recently. E.R.R. Eddison, obviously, which is sort of a contemporary of this, but also the Elemental Logic books, the Laura J. Marks series, where we kind of have this, I don't know, maybe this is just all in my head, but we sort of quote unquote know what genre fantasy is, and it's just kind of epic fantasy. But that's actually even though there's lots of books in that category, and lots of those books are huge and enormous and bestsellers, and they make movies and series of them and stuff, it's overall not a huge percentage of what the genre, quote unquote, is doing. There's a lot of just weird, hard to categorize stuff out there. So yeah, good to go back to this text of hard to categorize fantasy. So let's get into it. So LUD-IN-THE-MIST. This is Merle's third and final novel. It was originally published in 1926 in the UK by William Collins. This is definitely one of those Velvet Underground novels. Wasn't terribly famous outside specialist circles, at least until recently, and indeed it was frequently hard to get a hold of, but it was very influential on major voices in fantasy. There was an unauthorized Ballantine US version in the 70s, and various editions since. Just this year, there's a nice edition coming out from Union Square & Co. with an introduction by Catherine Arden, who did the Bear and the Nightingale. So LUD-IN-THE-MIST is remarkably resistant to synopsis. It's set in the eponymous town of LUD-IN-THE-MIST in the fictional county of Doramere. It follows Nathaniel Chanticleer, who is a prosperous merchant/politician, and his family and acquaintances, as a strange conspiracy involving fairy fruit, the abduction of the town's youth, the possible return of undead royal figures. There are moral panics. There's a long section about a decades-old murder mystery that goes on way longer than you think it's going to and is way more central than you think it's going to be. And the thing that I really noticed reading it, particularly this time, is how it veers between tone in a way you might not expect, between the comic and the unsettling, between really mundane scenes and like really striking supernatural scenes. There's nothing else I've read that's quite like it. So what's your relationship with this book? Do you remember the first time you encountered it, or do you have like a reason that you were drawn to talking about this one?
So I've loved LUD-IN-THE-MIST since the first time I read it, which was sometime in like 10 years ago, something like that. Horrific how time flies. I have this like Golan's edition with the very creepy tattooed fairy creature on the cover, which is not really the vibe of the book in any way, shape, or form. And I read it. I absolutely loved it. And then it affected my path enormously, because very soon after that, I came across the Fantasy and Lit program in Glasgow, and I saw that LUD-IN-THE-MIST was one of the things that were being taught in the curriculum. And that was a huge thing in what influenced my decision to sort of apply for the program. And that's how I ended up moving to Glasgow. And that's, the rest is history. Yes, I did my first University of Glasgow presentation on this book.
Oh, cool.
When I started my PhD, initially this was going to be one of the texts that I was going to study, because I knew that I wanted to talk about fantasy and theatre. And for me, LUD-IN-THE-MIST is a book about theatre in a very clear way that I noticed was not the way that this book was discussed. The PhD has changed since, as PhDs are wont to do, but the love for the book has remained, and the fascination with the kind of fantasy that Merle's brings and builds throughout this novel is definitely something that I find really interesting.
I wonder, would it be possible, I know this is a terrible request, but to kind of like, in a brief version, what is the sort of theater connection? Because I know it's something we're going to be returning to. So what's the kind of like super, super quick soundbite about why theater is important to this book?
So first of all, theater is really important to Merle's. Before she sort of switched to studying in Newham, she was a member of the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. Then in university, she was sort of part of a classics community. They read classic Greek theatre, they studied it, they discussed it, and so on and so forth. And she was very close with Jane Ellen Harrison, who, of course, was instrumental in discussing Greek ritual and theatre and so on and so forth. But even the novel itself is, for me, really closely connected with Euripides' Bacchae. There are plot elements and sort of echoes of the Bacchae in this book that I think are really interesting. The last rung in the chain, I promise, is that I think that this book is, in a way, this book is a thought experiment proof of Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, where you've got the two forces, you've got the Apollonian and the Dionysiac, And in order for tragedy to exist, in order for theater to exist, the two of them must combine. You must have both of them to have theater, which is, in a way, the story of LUD-IN-THE-MIST. In
Yeah,
order to
totally.
have LUD-IN-THE-MIST, you have to have the Dapple and the Doll. You have to have Fairyland and, the Luddites, the merchant class. There needs to be this reconciliation of the wild and the tame and so on and so forth. So yes, I think theater exists in every layer of this book. I hope this wasn't too insider baseball.
No, I think that's great. No, that's a really nice framing to come to it. I was keyed for it because you had mentioned when you wanted to talk about this, the Bacchae, and so that obviously, like, there are bits in here that really, really evoke that very, very directly, and probably a bunch that are less so that I missed. But it's interesting thinking about the Apollonian versus Dionysian sort of forces here, because one of the things I was really noticing this time I was reading it is how distinctly Merlees sort of draws a circle around law in this text and makes it something really weird. Like, it's not just like, oh yeah, the law. Like, people have these odd little speeches about what the law is and what the law is doing. I wrote down the line here somewhere. Yeah, it says, the law plays fast and loose with reality and no one really believes it. Like, setting up this idea of law as not just opposed to fairy and magic, but as something that's very much in parallel or like a version of it, that I just thought was really, really fascinating, and kept coming up a lot. And there's that whole, I don't know how much we'll get in the plot of this, but the very last bit of this book, when our protagonist, Nathan Chanticleer, has like basically gone to fairy / the land of the dead and come back. And that sort of triumphant moment where he's just identified with the law and is sort of like surrounded by this horde of elfish figures crying out, Chanticleer and the law, Chanticleer and the law. And it's this weird fusion, and it's very strange to read, especially because the book has done so much work setting up law as this very artificial, very invented thing, which is not to say it's like bad or fake per se, but it's kind of this other, almost his other set of magic that it's trying to get us to consider alongside the much more obvious, fairyish magic that's going on in here.
I think absolutely, and this part, the scene that you mentioned, is really funny because so far in the book, and throughout the entire book, we are entirely looking in through LUD-IN-THE-MIST. We're not seeing fairy. We're not really approaching. We are approaching fairy, but we're never in fairy. We don't have a perspective from any of the fairy characters. And so we have this view of fairy as one thing and the law as another, and the two of them existing in completely different planes. And then as soon as Nathaniel sort of approaches the border between Dorimer and Fairyland, it becomes clear that as far as the fairies are concerned, fairy and the law are not very, the law is not alien to them.
Right,
the law
yeah.
is something that they understand, and they're like, oh, he brought the law. It's not a foreign element. And when we eventually see Duke Aubrey, Nathaniel is not a foreign element.
Right.
Nathaniel is expected. Nathaniel is welcomed into this place that he thought was in this way completely different from his own.
One of the things, and this is sort of like, this is diving away from Nietzsche and Euripides for a little bit, but we'll be back, I'm sure. One of the things, just thinking about the borders here, that's so odd about this is, I think it's something a lot of shorter classic fairy tales do, but I rarely see books able to pull off at novel length the way this does, is I'm not clear how to think of this as a secondary world or not. It's similar to when we were talking with Jared Pekacek about Edison's work, where this is a fictional place that doesn't exist. It does border fairy, and all of the sort of normal people that we meet know that, and like that's not a contested fact. Like they know that fairyland exists. They know that the silent people live there. But there are also ways that this sort of feels like a very normal contemporary town somewhere in the UK. I'm not totally sure of like the time setting, but like they mention other places. I think they mention a Dutchman at one point, just kind of an idiom. So there's this way in which it's totally in a normal world and a secondary world at the same time. And there's something about that is really fascinating in that I don't know, that the novel pulls it off over the whole length. Another thing about this, and I'm not sure where to go with this, but I want to kind of dig into this a little bit, is the strange mix of effects that this book is doing. I think maybe this does tie back into Euripides a little bit, is this odd mix of whimsy and almost satire of sort of like small village life. I was thinking reading this a lot, because I was introduced to this, I think. I probably read about it, an essay somewhere. Might have been Michael Swanwick, who I know has written about this quite a lot and is an author I like. As, like pre-Tolkienian fantasy, as sort of like one of these sort of giants of that category. And I was reading this, I kept thinking a lot about The Hobbit and about Narnia. And worth noting, this predates both of those by a bit. Like The Hobbit was 37, Narnia was 1950. So this is like a chunk before. But there are bits here where I kept being like, oh, I kind of recognize this. This is kind of like The Shire. Like it has that kind of like lightly comic send up of sort of like countryside population. But then it veers into these strangely ominous, weird, surreal things just at the drop of a hat. And I want to read, I thought I had it bookmarked here. I want to read this section, this is super early on. This is just when our protagonist, Nathaniel Chanticleer, is introduced. And I just want to read like a paragraph or so, just because I think it really shows this weird movement. So this is just a page or two in. It's kind of like briefly set up the geography and kind of description of what the town is like with the gardens and the two rivers, one of which is like the mundane river and the other's the magical river. Okay, so Master Nathaniel Chanticleer, the actual head of the family, was a typical Doromarite in appearance, rotund, rubicund, red-haired, with hazel eyes in which the jokes, before he uttered them, twinkled like a trout in a burn. Spiritually, too, he passed for a typical Doromarite, though indeed it is never safe to classify the souls of one's neighbors. One is apt in the long run to be proved a fool. You should regard each meeting with a friend as a sitting he is unwittingly giving you for a portrait that probably, when you or he die, will still be unfinished. And though this is an absorbing pursuit, nevertheless the painters are apt to end pessimists, for however handsome and merry may be the face, however rich may be the background in the first rough sketch of each portrait, yet with every added stroke of the brush, with every tiny readjustment of the values, with every modification of the chiaroscuro, the eyes looking out at you grow more disquieting. And finally, it is your own face that you are staring at in terror, as in a mirror by candlelight, when all the house is still. And that's how this opens, describing this kind of like silly, chubby, rich guy. And then within a paragraph, we're at this bizarre fantasy of the terror of painting someone and finding that you're painting yourself. And those kinds of like odd flips and turns and twists kind of like pop up all through the book.
It's in the same page as the excerpt you just read. Is we see this first on the land before we see it about a person, because we have this beautiful description of walking down a pleached alley.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of it's a very disquieting passage, and merely says you enter boldly enough, but suddenly this turns scary, and so on and so forth. And it's this estrangement from the familiar, this taking something that you know very well and that you can imagine, whether it is a pleached alley or, as you said, a sort of just your average British guy,
Mm-hmm.
and turning it 90 degrees on its side so that it becomes something much more ominous and disquieting in its familiarity and unfamiliarity, so to speak. And it's on that precipice that the entire fantasy of this novel takes place, because you're never quite sure, as you said before, is this a secondary world? Is this the first? Is this our world? Is fairy the land of the dead? Is fairy something different? There's all these questions, and you're never immersed in the fantasy. You're always kept at the edge of your seat, and the second you sort of get drawn into this book, merely pulls you out by reminding you that you're reading a book.
Mm-hmm.
You're not experiencing something, you're reading words on a page. And she carries that through to the end, and I think it's that is how the novel ends. as everything has been sorted and you're like, okay, good, we're through, we solved the mystery, we reconciled Fairyland and LUD-IN-THE-MIST, everything is settled. And then she says, this is but another proof that the written word is a fairy, as mocking and elusive as Willie Wisp, speaking lying words to us in a feigned voice. So let all readers of books take warning, and with this final exhortation, this book shall close. Which is an insane way to end a book.
It's so good. Yeah. Oh my gosh. The kind of like epilogue here, like, like in like 80s comedy movies when they go to the credits and it shows like where did the characters go afterwards? Like maybe I'm thinking of like I can't remember a movie now that does this.
Legally Blonde.
Yeah, right. And it just kind of shows, oh, they went on to this, and it's kind of a funny haha thing. That's how this epilogue starts, and then it goes to the line you said. It just does this like, let's chicken out how everyone did, does that for like 2 paragraphs, and then it's like, by the way, the written word is a lie and a magic that's been cast over you. Like, oh, it's amazing. It's so wild.
It's really fascinating.
I love that passage you brought up about the alley, the pleached alley between the trees and that sort of moment. And there's this other one that comes up and keeps recurring throughout, which is the note, which is capitalized. And I was just, the first time I read this, it was probably a while ago for me. It might have been 20 years ago that I read this the first time. And it didn't stick in my mind. But coming back to this point, I like underlined it everywhere it showed up. It's such a weird, unsettling concept. So Nathaniel, the protagonist, when he's a boy, a teenager or something, and they're playing this game and they're getting down old stuff from the attic, and someone like plucks a note on like an old musical instrument of some kind, and it unsettles him and changes the whole course of his life. And he's sort of like, the way he sort of like lives in fear of hearing it, or maybe like thinks he hears it here and there. It feels like something out of, I don't know, like something out of Poe, like something out of like, I don't know, maybe some sort of magical realist like Cortázar or something. Just this ability to, or Kafka maybe, this ability to recognize that sometimes things in the world just strike us with this amazing force and stick with us, even though we don't know what they mean. And the way that, again, I kept thinking of Nathaniel and Bilbo, Nathaniel and Frodo as these sort of like, plump British, settled, happy, kind of boring people that have this thing running through them. And for Nathaniel, it's this little kernel of this weirdness and this terror of just kind of recognizing this almost like Lovecraftian, like maddening truth that's out in the world somewhere. Yeah, it's just wild. And then you turn the page and they're just having a dinner party, and you get like several pages about the dinner party and what they're eating, what kind of cheeses and what they're drinking. And then he'll see something that reminds him of the note. Yeah, wild.
And it's by the end of the book, you start and the note is something different and fairy fruit is something different. And by the end of the book, you realize that the note is just another expression of this all-encompassing metaphor that drives the book. And the note is just fairy fruit in another form. It's still, Duke Aubrey's honey, which is often bitter to the taste. And Nathaniel is experiencing the same state of being as the characters we meet who are eating fairy fruit. He just doesn't know it, and he's had a different experience of how he came to it, so that it's not cloaked in this taboo. It's the same draw, it's the same alienation from his own life, and he spends the whole book sort of running away from it, and that, we find out is the wrong thing to do, and then eventually he's forced to sort of face it head on, and even though that is the right thing to do, it still doesn't really make him happy. It's just a thing that is, and you can't really square it in any way, which I find very interesting. And how he comes to hear this note is, again, sorry, not to turn back to my own
No, please do.
little soapbox, but they were, as you said, they were playing dress up with his friends, and they were going to dress themselves up as the ancestors. So they found the old clothes and they dressed in grotesque wooden masks. They found old weapons and musical instruments and old costumes. tragic hierophantic robes that looked little suited to the uses of daily life. And this is, they found the staff of theater. They dressed up in the guises of, priests or actors. And when you go all the way back to ancient Greece, that is a fluid boundary than it is
interesting. Yeah.
today. And, he grabbed this ancient lute and was like in a very comic mood. And then it just brought about the complete change in his life.
The characters here and the novel, there's a weird relationship with the past. It's a very it's very haunting. It's very threatening. It's sort of I don't know, kind of denigrated at different points. Like I think at one point, what did they say? They say the past was dim and evil, a heap of rotting leaves. The past was silent and belonged to the silent people. And, we haven't talked much about the sort of in-world background of Duke Aubrey and that these people are all living in a sort of like, it's not totally clear how everything works, but in this sort of like rationally enlightened, sort of like disenchanted world after this more sort of like fantastic magical kingdom basically has been thrown down generations in the past. But it is also, it's a society and a culture that almost worships sort of normalness and tradition and sort of like staying what they are, which is weirdly in tension with this fact that like the past was actually a weird and different place. And how that keeps coming back in this text is really strange. And again, like, I don't, it's not particularly Lovecraftian, but I kept thinking about that idea of sort of like ancient evil, or at least ancient things that are framed as maybe beyond good and evil in this terrifying way. That's something that keeps coming up here. And the idea of, sort of like, right, Nathaniel is the mayor. He is like sort of the symbol of what the town is. And, everyone around him is sort of like high society folks who supposedly represent sort of the pinnacle of what this culture is. And at the same time, they're sort of terrified and haunted by the past all throughout. And the idea of the past returning is this thing that, there are characters in the book who are working for it and, really like idolize Duke Aubrey. What's the name of the schoolmistress?
Crabapple.
Yes, who is sort of like kind of like in love with the idea of basically the king returning. And then you have all these other people who are sort of like very skeptical about this sort of like heathen pagan kind of past. I don't know, it's such a weird tension.
But it's also, you sort of put your finger on it as you were describing it just now. This tension is mostly from the perspective of the current ruling class. Every character that we see who is not from the ruling class, who is from a lower social class, is essentially in favor, or at the very least has a much kinder relationship to Duke Aubrey and to the past. We have characters like the sailors who come in and out, the farmers, Body Bess, who is a deaf mute who just lives in the village and dances to things. And all of them love Duke Aubrey and have an active relationship with fairyland that the ruling class has sort of pushed aside. So I think Mirrorless is intentionally pointing to this question of the past as a classed thing, your relationship to the past as a classed relationship. Even Hempy, who is the sort of the Chanticleer's nurse for years and years, we find out eventually is just like, oh, I didn't say anything because I didn't want to upset you and I'm just a nurse, but actually I think fairyland is cool. And here's my old china that is from fairyland. It's very much a case of a ruling class who is afraid of a time when they weren't on top and therefore is afraid of a time where they might not be on top again. I think that's definitely a tension in the novel, and the past that is referred to and embraced by them, and the traditions that they uphold are the traditions of the revolution that brought them to power. And then the parts of the past that they shun and they make taboo, they make illegal, they censor, is the past that existed before their rule was complete. It's sort of like if we sort of more unfavorable connections with the present. It's sort of like,
Hmm.
late capitalism arguing that there was never anything except late capitalism.
Yeah, right. Maybe sort of like when you think of the Christian church, like repressing previously established local religions and sort of like rewriting them and kind of demonizing them in strange ways.
Absolutely. And the folk tradition and folk belief showing up in this book in the same way.
It's really interesting to try to piece out, and I don't think you can, but to try to piece out sort of what the truth about Duke Aubrey is here, because you get kind of like the ruling class's version of him first, right? As this sort of like rapacious, capricious, evil, mad with power tyrant who just went around taking whatever he wanted and like killing people for jokes. And you don't really get that. That doesn't really get contradicted, but you also find out that he's this like incredibly beloved figure, and like that has remained as well. And so trying to figure out what's going on there is really strange.
I think they're both true.
Yeah, I think they are too. Also, but I was thinking about how that. So there's this character here that we haven't talked about, Endymion Lear,
Excellent name.
one of the best character names I've ever encountered, and is such a weird character because, like, in one sense, he is sort of straightforwardly the primary antagonist or primary villain of the book. Like in one sense, he's also kind of just a doctor and a good character doing some strange stuff there. It's very weird. And trying to like sort of slot him morally is very strange. But he has at the end, he has that speech talking about why he did what he did and where he's come from and talking about Aubrey. And it's so satanic in like and I say this like positively. It's like, it's like in a sort of like Miltonian, like Byronic kind of way of talking about Aubrey as someone sort of beyond good and evil and doing things just because he was motivated to, and he makes the contrast between trees and men, which I thought it's a very strange contrast, but basically saying that like all living things are either like trees where they're basically like they're not in control of what happens to them. They just sort of take the sun and the rain as it comes, and that's all they are. And then they're men, and men go out and like do things and basically have free will. And saying that he was trying to get the Dormites, the Luddites, to be men, not trees. And so it suddenly gets very Garden of Eden talk. It recasts how we look at the fairy fruit, and it makes it like that much harder to read both Endymion throughout the book and Aubrey throughout the book, because it's less and less clear that there is any kind of like normal good and evil thing going on here.
And it's I think it's a very powerful metaphor in Endymion Lear's speech. And it's interesting that we see that as well. He posits that there's such a thing as trees and there's such a thing as men, and they are different things. And that Lud is sort of in the middle, and that middle is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But, and that I think is where Endymion Lear is wrong. Because the middle is what ends up winning at the end of the book. And it wins on both directions. We have the people of Lud embrace, again, the tragic, the thing that makes them men, what Endymion Lear was trying to do. But at the same time, we have this image that merely chooses to end the narrative other than the epilogue of the ships in the harbor growing fresh leaves and flowering, and it's this beautiful classic fantasy image that we see echoed again in things like Prince Caspian, for example.
Oh yeah,
which you mentioned Narnia before, and I wanted to bring up Prince Caspian because I think that is a book that is essentially the same story as LUD-IN-THE-MIST, if you think about it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
It's the land that used to be magic that is now mundane because of different men who do selling and buying, and sort of, they're pirates in that one and they're merchants in this one. And then at the end, someone goes out of their way to bring back the old god, the old sort of power of the wild. And that power of the wild comes with breaking the man-made creations and making the ships flower and sort of rewilding the land and the people, which is essentially what happens in LUD-IN-THE-MIST and is essentially what happens in the back here. Yes, there are trees and there are men, but the trees come alive and the men grow closer to the dead. So it's this very this case of Endymion Lear being almost right but not quite. And that's why presumably Duke Aubrey casts him aside and turns instead to Nathaniel as his emissary, as his voice to the people. It's also I think an image that has another echo in Ursula K. Le Guin's The Farthest Shore. Because there again we see that moment of sort of magic fading away, and there are all of those places where she talks about the magic being lost as being connected to the ability to make art being lost, and that art and that power of creation is something that fundamentally makes us human. And if we don't have that, we are tree people. Derogatory. Not tree people positive. Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff that would not be as easy to define as influences, but I think once you start thinking about it, a lot of what Mirrlees explores sticks to the fantasy genre.
I'm still here thinking about Caspian, just because I feel like I often kind of ding Lewis a little bit for just mixing mythologies willy-nilly, but this is making me think about his sort of deployment of a sort of more Greek pantheon idea in his work, which I mean is something that comes up elsewhere in his work too. Well, you know what? This is just a really great time to invite you to tell us a little bit about Dionysus. And for people who aren't familiar with the Bacchae, what's going on with that, and what are the resonances here?
So the Bacchae is a play by Euripides, and it's essentially the story of the revenge of Dionysus in the city-state of Thebes. Dionysus starts the play with a monologue in which he introduces essentially the past that has led into this conflict. And what happened is his mother was a princess. She got pregnant by Zeus. She asked Zeus to show her his true godly form. He did that. She died because of it. And no one believed that Dionysus was the child of Zeus. So they essentially cast her out. And they cast Dionysus out. And Dionysus goes back to Thebes to avenge his mother. And how he does that is he brings the Bacchae, who is his followers, and they are the chorus of the play, and they are a group of women who dance, which obviously echoes in LUD-IN-THE-MIST, because this is the students in Primrose Crabapple School, and they drive the women of Thebes mad. So they leave their houses and they run off to the mountain that is by Thebes, and they dance and worship Dionysus, and they have, they hunt. There's this sense of wildness. They're Maenads. That's where we get the sort of the Maenads from. And the king of Thebes is trying to shut it all down. He's Pentheus. He's Dionysus's cousin. And he takes Dionysus prisoner, and Dionysus essentially seduces him into dressing as a woman and joining the women of Thebes because he wants to see them at their dances. And he climbs a tree. They get him. They tear him to pieces. His own mother cuts off his head and sort of brings it triumphantly back into the city. And essentially, everyone realizes their mistake. Thebes becomes a city that worships Dionysus. That's the end of the play. Dionysus triumphant. Everyone else sort of having a miserable old time.
Whoops, we should have believed him. Yeah.
Yeah. If your weird cousin starts saying he's a god, maybe sort of. But yes, so that's the story of the Bacchae. It's, as I think I already tried to showcase, there are a lot of echoes of it in LUD-IN-THE-MIST, specifically with the sort of the idea of the Maenads, the women driven mad and sort of running off to the mountain to worship the forbidden god, quote unquote, which we see Nathaniel's daughter, the daughters of all of the ruling class of Lud. They are fed fairy fruit and they run off dancing off into the mountains. I don't think that's an accident. I think that's a clear reference from Miralis's part to European display, which, you know, we know that she was familiar with. It's a major work and so on. It's not as if you could escape it if
Yeah,
you're
right.
looking
If
at
you
the
were studying
classics.
that, right. So, boy, a bunch of stuff here. So, first off, just as an aside, I just want to mention that if listeners, if you haven't had a chance to like see it in some version, like do so. Like, it's such a fascinating play, and it just resonates. It's one of my favorite stage performances I've ever seen. I saw it. Oof, I don't want to think about how long ago, but I saw it in this like little black box theater, where all of the actors very much like moved through the crowd and came like it started with Dionysus coming out and saying, "I'm a god, worship me," and waited. And when no one in the audience worshipped him, like shook a staff, was like, "No, I need you to worship me in order for this to start," and like made us worship him. It's a fascinating play, and it's besides all that it's doing thematically, it's so rich and weird tonally, and that is what I think resonates so much with LUD-IN-THE-MIST. Besides the specifics, and I think you're 100% right that the sort of like youth of the town, the maidens sort of being swept away, feels very much the same thing. Aubrey sort of like haunting the background of the whole thing feels like this rejected magical figure who is getting his revenge. But there's something about Dionysus and wine and revelry, and the sort of, I don't know, the magic or spiritual or religious significance of the sort of like revelry of it, and the fairy fruit. And the fairy fruit is really strange and rich here. And I often feel like when I'm praising a book lately, I often wind up saying something like, I have a hard time imagining this being written quite this way today, because the fairy fruit here is so ambiguous, and it stays ambiguous, and it almost seems minor, and it almost seems like the book kind of forgets about it for long stretches. And it's very rarely sort of directly on the page. There are very few places where people actually see it, very few places where people like actually eat it that you know of, but it sort of is in the background all throughout. And there are points reading it today where I'm like, oh, like this feels very much like a moral panic about drugs and or sexual queerness, right? That like something is changing our children and we need to protect them from it. And it feels like that very clearly. And then there are other parts where it doesn't feel like that at all. And it feels like it's this symbol of nature that has been cut off from modernity, and like people are kind of starving for it. And there are places where it's doing stuff that's a lot harder to figure out. And you're not sure throughout how much fairy fruit has really been around, or if it's something they're just panicked about. Like, you do find out some kind of concrete things about how it's been being smuggled in and stuff. But it's one of those things almost like, I don't know, almost like some sort of political scare where everyone's like, like during the Red Scare, where like everyone thinks everyone's a communist. Like everyone here thinks like, oh yeah, all the lower class are doing fairy fruit. And you're like, well, are they? I don't know.
But also, the fairy fruit is made into taboo, so the upper classes are using the fear of fairy fruit to sort of oppress the lower class. The fact that the lower class has been eating fairy fruit, and we find out by the end that it was actually very widespread
Mm-hmm.
in LUD-IN-THE-MIST. It was constantly smuggled in, but it didn't really have any of the adverse effects that the upper class was warning them about. It's just another thing that they're afraid of. So merely upsets that narrative of fairy fruit as something all powerful
Mm-hmm.
by showing us that actually it's fine. The dangerous thing is not having it,
Mm.
or having it once and then not having it again.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think, I agree, if this story was written today, that would not be the message that you take away from fairy fruit. And if the story was written at any other time by any other person, this would not be the message that you get from fairy fruit. Think of how different the sort of the use of fairy fruit is in Rossetti's Goblin Market,
Right. Yeah.
where it is unambiguously this evil thing, this thing from which danger comes, and there it's very clearly sort of tied to sexuality in a way that I think
Mm-hmm.
merely is echoes here. But one of my greatest pet peeves when discussing this book is when people think that it's very clear that the fairy fruit is one specific thing, metaphor for one specific thing and nothing else. Like, I think that fairy fruit is a very porous metaphor, and I think it has to be, otherwise the book collapses. I think if you just read Blood-in-the-Mist thinking, oh, fairy fruit is a metaphor for queerness, for example, and nothing else, then it doesn't work. The book does not work. In this last reread that I did for this, one of the things that I kept thinking about is one of the other things that fairy fruit can be a metaphor for is political unrest itself. You can read, the girls of the upper class read eating fairy fruit. You could rewrite that and they're like reading Marx and then taking off into the mountain to become communists.
Totally.
It still works. Yeah, I think it plays into those moral panics. It plays into those fears that an upper class would have, whether they are, quote unquote deviants, any aberration from the norm, essentially, and anything that brings them on more equal footing with, the rest of the people that they're on top of, the people that they're oppressing.
Porousness, like the porosity of this book, is maybe one of its strongest elements, right? That it sets up all these hyper clear boundaries. That here's Love-in-the-Mist, and here's Fairyland, and here's good, and here's evil. Here's, for that matter, here are the people who are still alive, and here are the people who are dead, and then keeps showing throughout that nope, like everything partakes of both, and the way that boundary keeps getting crossed, and it has always been getting crossed, is such a big part of it.
And it's on the level of the story itself. Again, sort of like we said earlier, a thing that a lot of people mention is that halfway through this book changes genre and is suddenly a 16-year-old murder mystery.
Yeah.
But actually, the 16-year-old murder mystery has been in it from the start. You see it's the slipper that they find, and they think that the slipper is embroidered with fairy fruit, and they take that as proof that this is what's happening. It's not fairy fruit on the slipper, it's something else. But because fairy fruit is the fear, fairy fruit is what's being read. So I think she does this amazing juggling feat of telling you these two stories on top of each other like a palimpsest. And sometimes you see one and sometimes you see the other. And you're constantly confused, and you're constantly like following the wrong one almost until the very end. And I find that fascinating. It's
and so much of what of how it's doing that in the text, it's how it's setting up Nathaniel Chanticleer and sort of a couple people in his family and acquaintances as the main points of view, and the narrator like following them very, very closely. And so much of this novel is basically like I don't want to say a comedy of manners, because like they pretty quickly get into kind of the mysteries and the murders and things, but so much of it is at this like almost domestic level, lightly satirical sort of portrait of life in this town that happens to have these odd things going on, but then keeps every chapter introducing more and more and more of these strange, unsettling things going on. And that switch from when Chanticleer is just kind of like the mayor and very settled and like is kind of worried about his son, so he kind of sends him off to be well, and kind of worried about this or that, but like, oh, it's taking care of itself. And then suddenly that flip of him going off to solve these mysteries and do all this stuff. I've never read anything that does that so well, where usually, if this were a quest novel or a portal fantasy or something, you'd get a couple chapters at home, right? And then you would go off. And this is, except maybe for like the very last little bit, this is basically all at home. Like this whole novel, with very few exceptions, take place in kind of like known environments around family members and friends, just kind of discussing stuff. Even the scenes out on the farm, which we later find out have some kind of like sinister stuff going on, but even those just feel very like kind of tight and kind of homely. And then suddenly you get this weird stuff running through it.
And that is because in part, Nathaniel and Ambrose and the citizens of Lud think that there is this difference in place, that Lud is home and home is different from fairy, but it's not. Home is full of hollow the walls are hollow, and that's how fairy fruit is smuggled in through the family chapel.
Mm-hmm.
Duke Aubrey in this book, I think, has a very similar position as the Raven King does in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, in that he's always there but not there,
Mm-hmm.
seen but not seen, understood but not understood.
Yeah, and texturally is very ambiguous and irrelevant the whole way through, right? Like the only times that he is like on the page, like the only times he's quote unquote like on screen, that someone in the time of the narrative sees him, are in these very questionable times, right? And as far as we know, there's no reason to think that Duke Aubrey wasn't just a normal duke, right? Who died 100, 200, 300 years or whatever before the novel begins, but then is still around in this odd way. And obviously like Dionysus, right, is just kind of moving and poking people, but not really actively there very much.
So that's exactly the thing, that in Euripides, and specifically, the thing I have in mind is the Anne Carson translation of the Bacchae and her introduction to that, because that's I think the best production of the Bacchae I saw was at the Almeida with Ben Whishaw as Dionysus.
Oh, what?
He was fantastic.
Oh, cool.
He came on stage and was, his usual unassuming, very sort of like effeminate and threatening presence. And then at the Worship Me, when no one worshipped him, he slammed his staff into the ground and his entire posture changed, and he became this threatening figure. Ben Whishaw. But yes, so when Dionysus is described, he's described as something supernatural, not exactly god, ghost, spirit, angel, principle, or element. He's a half-mortal, half-god demon who cannot be described appropriately in English. There isn't a word in the English language that really encompasses what Dionysus is. And that's the same as Duke Aubrey. He exists in this gray area between humanity and godhood, and in between opposites. He Endymion Lear, when he describes him, he calls him his fickle, bittersweet master, the lord of life and death, of laughter and tears. It's in this contradiction that Duke Aubrey exists. You can't have one without the other. You can't have the loving master without having the cruel master. You have the laughter and the tears, and so on and so forth. So we have this figure that is so callous and cruel to the people who worship him. And at the same time, when we do get Duke Aubrey on the page and he's talking to Nathaniel, he's so gentle.
Yeah.
He seems regretful that he is the way he is. He says, I have often wished my honey were not so bitter to the taste. I would find an antidote to the bitter herb of life, but none grows the side of the hills or the other. There is this kindness and this love in Duke Aubrey as a figure that is absolutely, I think, part of what makes this book so addictive.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there's something also there about that sort of porosity, that porousness you identified. This story would be very easy to set up as an opposition between kind of like hedonism and Puritanism, right? Like between, like, you could have made Chanticleer and all the other Dormerites, the upper class Dormerites, these very like uptight, stuffy, rigorously moral. And there's a little bit of that, but you also kind of see them, they're kind of clownish, they're kind of buffoonish. They're very into their feasts, they're very into their wine and their, what is it, the wild time gin, right, that he makes. And they are very sensual in a way. So it sort of like softens the opposition. This is not just between like order and disorder, between harmony and chaos or something like that. It's stranger than that.
This is where I think the influence of The Birth of Tragedy comes in, because what Nietzsche posits in The Birth of Tragedy is that you can't have a society that is just Dionysiac. You can't have a society that is just barbarism and hedonism and so on and so forth. This does not lead anywhere. And indeed, if you have a society like that, the Apollonian will rise up against it, as the merchants rose up against LUD. And then what you get if you just have a society of worshipping Apollo is you get something that's stagnant. You have something that is unchanging. You have something that is completely incapable of art. You get the cheap cynicism that Mirrlees identifies here, and that the way to a great civilization, the way to sort of winning, quote unquote, building a society is harmony between the two, both of them existing, holding each other in check. Apollo, the god of music, and Dionysus, the god of theater, brought together into Athenian tragedy, essentially. This is a very poor summary of Nietzsche, but this is what we get in LUD-IN-THE-MIST. LUD without Duke Aubrey is bad, but LUD entirely under the rule of Duke Aubrey is also bad. The sort of happy middle is Chanticleer and the law bringing fairy fruit into LUD. It's balancing the two and not trying to deny any part of it and hide away any part of the experience of being human.
I'm having this year where I keep seeing Fritz Lang's Metropolis everywhere, and like we've got like that, right? We need like between the head and the hands, we need a mediator.
As I was talking, I was thinking of N.K. Jemisin's The 100,000
Oh
Kingdoms.
yeah,
You you have the god of light and you have the god of darkness, and both of them by themselves are the worst thing you could possibly have for a society. You need to have them both, and you need to have the third person in the triangle in the middle to sort of keep them in check. We see all of the characters in LUD-IN-THE-MIST who are too strongly one way or the other come to no good. It's holding both of them making sure both sides are represented and at peace that is the solution. God, I'm making this sound like the most centrist novel ever.
Right? I know it doesn't read that way.
No.
But no, you're right. When you keep talking about the balance, it sounds like it. But no, it's doing something much stranger than like centrism. Yeah. So listeners, don't fear that we're trying to seduce you with centrism or something like that. You know,
God forbid.
Yeah. You know what? That's probably a good time. Let's take a really quick break. All right, we're going to come back. I want to read this passage, which doesn't do any plot work at all, and therefore is my favorite kind of passage. So this is when, Nathaniel Chanticleer's son, Ranulph, has maybe, been exposed to fairy fruit. And they basically, they send him off to the farm to kind of get well out in the country, fresh air, reconnect to nature. That's the idea. So this is just a little thing of him being sent off, and they're on their carriage ride out there. And it says, where do I want to start here? Okay. From time to time, terrestrial comets, the blue flash of a kingfisher, the red whisk of a fox, would furrow and thrill the surface of the earth with beauty. And in the distance, here and there, standing motionless and in complete silence by the flowing dapple, were red-roofed villages, the least vain of all fair things, for they never looked at their own reflections in the water, but gazed unblinkingly at the horizon. And there were ruined castles covered with ivy, a badge of the old order, clinging to its own. And into the ivy doves dived, seeming to leave in their wake a trail of amethyst, just as a clump of bottle green leaves is shot with purple by the knowledge that it hides violets. And the round towers of the castles looked as if they were so firmly encrusted in the sky that, to get to their other side, one would have to hew out a passage through the celestial marble. Now that's just a landscape scene. I am mildly infamous in a couple book clubs I'm in for being team bushes, team trees. Give me more bushes, give me more trees. And that idea, that phrase came up when we were discussing one of Sofia Samatar's books. who I'm not positive that LUD-IN-THE-MIST is an influence on her, but I was thinking about some of her work while reading this, just for some of these really rich passages and some of these sort of whimsical descriptions of things like the dances, some of the names for the dishes of food that they make and the things that they drink have these like very interesting, strange, resonating kind of names. And I was thinking about her, and one of the things we were talking about in the break was about these kind of invisible lines of influence that this book might have. And when you mention LUD-IN-THE-MIST, the chances that people will know that as opposed to The Lord of the Rings are very low. But I wanted to hear more. You've mentioned a couple currently living or like more recent authors that came after Merlees, and how they might be in some kind of connection or conversation with this. I just wanted to kind of hear more about what you think this book has done and what it's doing still.
Yes, as we were talking in the break, I think there is very much this belief that in the history of fantasy, there's a lot of people, not academics, for the most part. I'm sure there are academics who think that as well. But for a casual reader of fantasy, there's this very clear idea of a tradition that starts with Tolkien, that starts with The Lord of the Rings. And what we see is that fantasy as we understand it today, because it's not as if you couldn't place Hope Mirrlees next to currently living and working authors of fantasy. It's not like you could read this book and not recognize it as being fantasy. But there's almost this other forgotten tradition that includes the works of Hope Mirrlees, that includes the works of Sylvia Townsend Warner, who wrote Lolly Willows, which is a book about a spinster who becomes a witch and sells her soul to the devil, and is where the name of my cat comes from. Show my ass in my influences. You have authors like Naomi Mitchison, who wrote what I think is one of the finest Arthurian stories ever written, To the Chapel Perilous, which is completely it's currently in print in the worst edition possible, full of like typos and badly edited, just horrific. But it's a beautiful work, and it's contemporary, for example, to T.H. White. But when you think about Arthuriana, you think about T.H. White, you don't think about Naomi Mitchison. There is this almost forgotten tradition of female fantasists coming down through the generations and really bringing fantasy to new and exciting and different places. And we very rarely talk about them with as much attention and affection as we do their male counterparts. My PhD is on the relationship between fairy, that's fairyland, and theatre. And initially by accident and eventually by choice, I am entirely looking at the work of female authors. Because if you're able to write a PhD in fantasy and just talk about men, you should be able to write a PhD in fantasy and just talk about women. And it's a choice as any other. So I'm looking at the work of Terri Windling as an editor and how she really opened completely new avenues for what the fantastic could be with her work at Ace and then at Tor, and her work as a writer and her work as an artist and a sort of a builder of community and a really, really powerful figure. She has published all of the collections of short stories, but she's also published the fairy tale retellings, which include Pamela Dean's Tamlin, which is one of the key texts of my thesis, and include authors like Tanith Lee and J.D. Olin and a million other people, Ellen Kushner's Thomas the Rhymer. You have this tradition of fairy writing and of thinking about fairy and thinking about art that leads to these very interesting places and these really porous, hard to categorize books that I think we should read more and think about more. Jo Walton's, among others, is another one that is really interesting to think in relation to Hope Mirrlees's LUD-IN-THE-MIST. Cat Howard's Roses and Rot, a lot of the work of Elizabeth Hand, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a huge Elizabeth Hand fan and constantly annoyed that so much of her back catalogue is impossible to get hold of. It's
Mm-hmm.
out of print and not going back into print anytime soon. But here's an author who has worked for so long into these intersections of theatre and fairy and of Greek ritual and Greek myth in sort of its pure form rather than the more straightforward retellings.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth Hand has worked on that so much. This is the time of dark academia. No one is talking about Waking the Moon, which is What If the Secret History, but fantasy and on crack. So, yes, I think that the thing that I wanted to talk about is the different views and the different avenues of what fantasy is and what fantasy can be. And I realize now that I did all of this without mentioning, the person we sort of essentially opened this episode with, who is Amal al-Mukhtar, who is very much from that tradition and pays homage to that tradition. I've not read the novel yet, but I'm looking forward to it so much.
Yeah, it's good. And she's been such a booster of people like Mitchison. I think is got her back in the conversation in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that we keep seeing time and time again, right? Is that more often than not, the way to get these female authors back into the conversation is to just start talking about them and keep talking about them and their influence and their importance. But we always seem to be doing it more for the past and not so much for people who are still working, still writing.
Right.
Like Terri has a new book coming out soon, or I think it's being finished soon. But The Woodwife is finally back in print, for example, which is extremely exciting because, again, it was out of print for so long. And there are a lot of things that have never been out of print, and I think should have been. So it's. I don't mean that. I think everyone can read whatever they want, and everything should be available.
There's a finite number of shelves out there. Some of them got to go, and some of the ones. That's the we'll twist what's Gandalf's line. Not everything that goes out of print should go out of print. And many things that don't go out of print should.
And it turns out so often it turns out to be women's works that go out of print.
It's going to be this episode will come out. It'll be like ancient history and internet time. There was that article in The Guardian about, did you see this, about romantasy that managed to imply it was yet another one of those, like, did you know that women can write fantasy? Like, published in the year of our Lord 2025. I'm like, what is happening? How do we keep having the same conversation like every year, it feels like?
It is in part because people very rarely are in a position where they can find out that things are not new. Romantasy is hugely popular right now. My confession here is I've never read a Sarah J. Maas book, and at this point I'm not going to. I'm really sorry. Not my thing.
I am on the edge of my seat because I know eventually someone is going to ask me to do it, and I'm going to say yes immediately.
Excellent.
So I'm readying myself, yeah.
But see, I've never read Sarah J. Maas, for example, but I mentioned earlier N.K. Jemisin's The 100,000 Kingdoms. Is that not similar?
Right.
Is that not in the same ballpark? I have behind me on the shelf, 3 Jacqueline Carey books. Is Kushal's Dart not something that we should be talking about in the same? So, I'm not against romanticism as a thing. And in fact, I have read a lot of books that I would consider to be part of that tradition. But what you see is in a lot of people who are just entering this, they are just starting to read these genres now, there is no way for them to know that there is a tradition that they could look back at. And I think that eventually, it leads to bad books, because if you're not aware that there is a continuity and there is, as I said, a tradition, then you're only influenced by the now, and you end up creating essentially identical books in different colors, which I think is dull.
There was that, I don't know where that article was, about the lawsuit about the copyright case about the Romantasy book.
Yeah, I was going to say there's this other thing of like, this is the time of IP, right? And so everyone is thinking about copyright law, even though why should you need to really? Um, and there's AI comes into this as well, because it's like the idea is the thing and the execution is nothing. Whereas like, no, you're a writer. Your work is your work is a craft. Ideas are good. Anyone can have ideas. Not anyone can be a writer.
Right.
It's this stagnation. Exactly. To bring it back into LUD-IN-THE-MIST, what seems to be happening now is that we are forgetting our past. We are demonizing our past. We are sort of pushing it away and focusing on this self-replicating present that leads us to creative stagnation, that leads us to just endless recycling of the same things again and again and again, without anything going out there and sort of breaking the mold in the way that LUD-IN-THE-MIST today, reading it, feels like you're breaking a mold. There's this loss of wildness, this loss of where we come from, that means that we can't really go anywhere. But yes, so I think it's really important to look back and to read back and to challenge our own understanding of what the past in general was like and what the past of fantasy in particular was like. If you find yourself thinking a generalized statement like there was Tolkien and there were Tolkien imitators, that's a lie. That's an easy thought to have, but it's an easy thought because it's not a real thought. If you go back and you read and you try and find the things that are really difficult to get a hold of, you will find a wealth of stuff that rivals the stuff that is being published today. You will find diverse work. You will find unique work. A couple of years ago, I used to have a theatre group here in Glasgow, and we staged a play by a fantasist called Nicholas Stuart Gray, who it came out during our rehearsals. There was this article published that revealed that Nicholas Stuart Gray was a trans man living and working in the UK in the 60s, the early 60s, writing fantasy fiction. And the play that we were working on was based on the story of the Seven Swans by Hans Christian Andersen. And it was about the sort of the seventh swan of the story and so on and so forth. But the work by people in the margins is has always been done and is always there if you look for it. Sometimes you have to make a point of looking for it. Sometimes you may stumble onto it. You just need to be open and receptive to the notes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Oh, that's a great way to put it. I was when I read that article, that Guardian article, and I was kind of following the internet shouting about it. One of the things I was thinking about was, when you get these incorrect narratives, right? That basically this sort of like bad canonizing, right? And saying that like basically only men have a literary history, right? And just like erasing everything. And, and more than that, only cis white men, it's very restrictive. And just sort of ignoring that there's history around that. Like, okay, like we agree that's bad, like we shouldn't be doing that. Well, we people shouting about it. I don't know if everyone else agrees. But it was making me think a lot about what are the material conditions of communicating alternate canons and alternate histories that do capture more of this stuff. And it's not like there's one easy answer, but I think you're right that just kind of like looking for it is a big part. And I don't know, if someone is entering fantasy for the first time, in their, I don't know, early teens or something like that, and what they're finding is Sarah J. Maas or whatever, like, that's fine. But I wonder, like, where else are they finding, like, a record to go back? How do you go and find back? And there are more and more university courses that are teaching fantasy and presumably doing a better job of it. If you stumble onto awards lists, I think you can start seeing, because, particularly in the last, 10, 20 years, it's been a very, very diverse and inclusive kind of awards scene in a lot of ways with a lot of great work. But yeah, I was just thinking about how do you find that if you're coming into it kind of blank, and you read an article in the newspaper that women are writing fantasy for the first time, you know, how do you find LUD-IN-THE-MIST? How do you find, you know, Memoirs of a Space Woman? Like, where do you hear about it? And this is not like a question so much as sort of like an encouragement to everyone, right? Like, go shout about these books and keep telling people about them. But it's a challenge when you have these major, like big budget adaptations of Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings that sort of like dominate the scene. And that's kind of what people think fantasy is in its entirety, and just hides all this stuff. I think
the only way to find it is to sort of be in spaces where people talk about it, which is a bit of a, you know,
yeah,
an Ouroboros.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's a bit of an Ouroboros situation.
Ooh,
you need to
Edison reference. That's good. It takes us back.
Yeah. You need to be in it before you know that you're in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, for me, it's been really helpful to go through publications and read what people are writing about it, what people are discussing, and what people are reading. And so I think it's important to like talk about the things that we read, even if they're not quote unquote trendy titles. I think not to sort of be sycophantic for my last second there, but I think the work that this podcast is doing is very important in the things that it chooses to discuss and it chooses to look at. But that's the thing. We need to be talking about things. We need to be sharing things we read, sharing work, yelling until the spaces for these works open up again. Hope Mirrorless was out of print for years and years and years and years. She's not out of print anymore. She's in every bookshop, at least in the UK. She's everywhere. But she's in every bookshop. Naomi Mitchison, for example, Memoirs of a Space Woman, is not as much. As I said before, my favorite book of hers and one of the greatest pieces of Arthuriana I've ever read is unfindable. So what to do? You just talk about it and read it in the bad editions and read it in the weird files on the internet. You yell about it until someone sort of chooses to listen to you and to do the work that you need doing, which isn't really an answer to your question.
No, I think it is.
Hopefully.
Yeah. No, I really think it is. I think that is the simplest answer. I mean, we're not, unless anyone has like a spare like publishing house tucked away that they're willing to just commit a massive advertising budget to, and we can correct
this. Just call me.
Yeah.
Just call me. Yeah. I have plans.
Thanks so much. This was a really, really great conversation. And before we depart, I just wanted to say, if it wasn't clear from our comments throughout this episode, this book just rips. Like, on a line level, I was just like screaming.
It's so good.
Yeah.
It's so good.
And like, I have so many written down. I'm not going to read them, but like, it is so good at having these odd turns to like the psychologically uncanny, and then the very next line will be like this sort of like catty comment about another character, and like a weird satire. Like, to take one, like there's this point where they make a point of saying how dumb Dame Marigold is, like how stupid Nathaniel's wife is, and then like the very next chapter she like outsmarts the whole plot by like walking into the town hall and noticing everything, and like you really clearly see that everyone was wrong about her, but it doesn't make a big deal of it. It's just like the book just is packed with all of these strange little asides and observations about people. Anyways, we can't keep talking about this book.
And it's also a deeply human book. I'm so sorry. I have been so good. I've read hardly any of the things I've underlined, but it's such a deeply human book with an understanding of, you know, psychology and what being human is and stuff like that, that it has such a tenderness in between all the archness and the sort of the sharpness. It also manages to be just tragic and beautiful. And yeah, it's not one thing or the other. It's all of the things.
Before we get going, is there anything you want to share about anything you're working on, or where people can find you online or anything like that?
I am currently not on many social media. I am on Instagram in Marita Arvaniti, which is just my name and surname, very unhelpfully. But this is pretty much the only place I hang out at the moment. I'm just working on my PhD, so my answer to this is very, very boring.
That's fair. No, that's cool. Thanks again so much for joining. Thanks so much for poking us to read this book. Listeners, I'll put lots of show notes about everything we talked about. And if you haven't read LUD-IN-THE-MIST, it is a treat. Pick it up. It's wonderful. Thank you so much. And best of luck with the PhD.
Thank you for having me.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Barcha Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabrielle Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, that is very cool of you. Go to patreon.com/ancillary-review to become a backer. Come hang out with us on Discord. If you heard us talk about a book and you want to buy that book, check out our show notes for a bookshop link. We get a cut. Finally, you know the drill. Leaving a review or a rating really helps wherever you listen to us. Sharing our posts on your favorite social media really helps. Telling someone out on the street that you should check us out. I don't know if that'll help or not. It might if they like speculative fiction. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com. Next time on A Meal of Thorns, Christian P. Haynes is joining us to talk about both Robert A. Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress and Annalee Newitz's The Terraformers. Thinking about calling this The Terra is a Former Mistress? We're workshopping it. It's going to be a bit of a ride. Tell your libertarian friends to steer clear and also to wise up. Lots more on the way. Check out ancillaryreviewofbooks.org/A Meal of Thorns if you want to read ahead. Until next time, read closely. Make some trouble out there. We need it.
This is the worst way anyone has ever expressed this very common idea, I feel like, but
I'm sure there's been worse.
thank you. This fixes it.